Good morning. Good morning. All right, while everyone is still coming in, I would love to kick off this session. So first of all, thank you very much to all of you for joining us today. I know for the New York Knicks fans here in the room, it was very late last night. Unfortunately, the outcome wasn't what we had hoped for, but at least we probably get an additional game to enjoy. So let's look at the bright side here. Thank you also for everyone who is on the live stream watching us here, and welcome as well. My name is Max Neukirchen. I am the co-head of global payments at JPMorgan Chase, but more importantly, I'm a proud board member of the Center for an Urban Future, and that is also why I'm here today. The Center for an Urban Future is a policy organization focused on strengthening New York City and all its neighborhoods, and on expanding economic opportunities for all New Yorkers. CUF's research consistently drives attention to issues, opportunities, and ideas that are important for our city and that often have flown under the radar screen. And we put forward ideas that are innovative, bold, but also achievable at the same time. And most importantly, CUF is focused on getting results. We have consistently sparked new policies and investments in the city, everything from boosting outcomes for CUNY students to thoughts about how we can strengthen libraries. And that is exactly also why last year, Cranes published a cover story about CUF, calling it the think tank quietly influencing New York City's top officials. We think this is a really great summary of what the Center for an Urban Future does. Today, we are here to spark change around another really important topic. An opportunity to unlock public-private partnerships for supporting and strengthening parks across all 5 boroughs. Today's discussion here with all of you, along with a new policy brief that CUF will publish in the coming weeks, is the latest in a series of conversations that we have been holding to think about how we can sustainably fund New York City's parks. And I'm sure you all have been to the many parks that we have in the city and have an appreciation of how important they are for all of us who live in New York City. There's a lot happening in our parks today. But for decades, the city has struggled to keep the funding up with the pace it needs to sustain all the activities in the parks. So in partnership with the New York City Green Fund, CUF has been advancing some concrete ideas for how city leaders can establish new recurring revenues for parks. We, for example, wrote about the opportunity to create a ticket surcharge at sports events that could provide incremental funding to parks. We also made the case for a modest increase in new concessions in parks for a way of boosting recurring revenues. And most recently, we also outlined some ideas how the city can leverage its real estate portfolio to also think about how to provide incremental funding to the city's parks. So now about the event today. We have an amazing group of speakers here that help us delve into the opportunity about how public-private partnerships can unlock the opportunities we have in parks. And that amazing set of speakers also includes Deputy Mayor Julia Kerson, who is joining us here today. Thank you very much to all of our speakers who made their way here. Now, when we are talking about thank yous, I also want to give a heartfelt thank you to the New York City Green Fund. The Green Fund has not only made today's event possible, but it has supported CUF's research on parks for now more than 3 years and has been a critical partner in making all this work possible. We are really grateful for their support and partnership. And now it is my great pleasure to hand it off to our next speaker, CUF Executive Director, Jonathan Bowles. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I kind of feel like Jose Alvarado following Wemby. Thanks so much, Max. And thanks so much for all of you to be here. What a great turnout. This is amazing. Clearly a lot of interest in our parks and in public-private partnerships and in solutions that help improve and expand our parks. I'm Jonathan Bowles, Executive Director of the Center for an Urban Future. As Max mentioned, my colleagues and I at CUF have been publishing a series of reports and holding a series of policy forums detailing tangible opportunities to establish new revenues, new recurring revenues to support parks. As Adrian Benepe said earlier, I think today is like game 5 in this series of forums that we've been having. But in addition to new revenue streams, we think that there's an opportunity to develop the next generation of public-private partnerships for supporting parks in every corner of our city. Now, New York has a lot of experience with public-private partnerships. In fact, I think no other city has probably been as successful as New York in tapping public-private partnerships to support and strengthening vital services, spaces, and infrastructure. From civic-minded corporations and labor unions that helped New York avert bankruptcy in the 1970s, to the creation of business improvement districts and parks conservancies. With the city now facing a precarious fiscal situation that is likely to worsen in the year ahead, we think it's time to get creative about new public-private partnerships that it can help care for, improve, and sustain the city's parks and open spaces. In the next few weeks, CUF will publish a new report outlining 5 specific ideas for how the city can unlock public-private partnerships to support and strengthening New York's parks. We're also extremely excited to hear from the thoughtful experts in the room today, from former city officials who have worked on public-private partnerships to people working on the ground with parks and open space partner groups. I'm super excited about today's discussion. I'm also incredibly excited to welcome our next speaker, Deputy Mayor for Operations, Julia Kerson. We are just 6 months in, but this administration is already doing important and innovative things around the public realm, on parks and recreation, on bikes and buses, on climate, on sanitation, on so many other things. And so much of this is being driven by or executed by Deputy Mayor Kerson. We're thrilled that she's agreed to speak this morning. Please join me in welcoming Deputy Mayor Kerson.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you to the Center for Urban Future for having me here today. I'm honored to be with so many New Yorkers who care deeply about our city's parks and open spaces. When I stepped into this role, I did so with over 15 years of experience delivering large-scale infrastructure. My focus has been on moving complicated projects from conception to implementation, on time and on budget at the very least. I say this because I'd like to state a simple truth. Parks are not a luxury, they are infrastructure. They are as essential to this city's functioning as subway lines, water mains, and bridges. And for too long, we have not treated them that way. That changes under this administration. Mayor Mamdani has made a clear and firm commitment to reaching 1% of the city budget dedicated to our park system during his mayoralty, 1 cent on every single dollar. Because parks are not only good for the environment, our health, and our happiness, they generate economic value as well. It can be a challenge to figure out exactly how to tap into that value. We have seen localized success drawing funding for parks from special purpose entities, but when we zoom out, we see a picture of inequity. We are excited to be working with CUF and other partners to make sure that parks are funded like the infrastructure that they are. equitably and intentionally across all neighborhoods. But funding is only a part of the story. How we deliver, how we govern, matters just as much. This administration is serious about achieving excellence rooted in the real needs of our neighbors. That means being honest about what is working and fixing what is not. It means when a young boy named Max pops up on our Instagram feed because his favorite playground isn't open yet, we come up with a way to open it faster. It means when New Yorkers are amped up for the World Cup and rooting for Knicks in 5, we announce our sports courts and athletic, I had to write and change that. And athletic fields will be lit up even later into the night. And it means doing the wonky things that work, expanding parks concessions to generate revenue and improve the experience of parkgoers, and streamlining the delivery of infrastructure and public realm projects through the mayor's new Commission on Government Efficiency. This is an administration committed to doing things differently, to breaking down the silos that have slowed us down, silos that I know each of you know far too well. And we want to solve for these issues. Tonight at 5 p.m. at the New York Law School in Manhattan is our COGE hearing on streamlining government for infrastructure and the public realm. Many of the barriers to truly activating our public spaces are written into our charter. So please come and tell us your experiences so we can be informed as we focus our reform efforts. Across this room are the conservancies, the block associations, the community gardeners, the local organizations that work every day to do what no city agency can ever do alone. You know your parks, you know your neighbors, you provide programming that is responsive, culturally grounded, and deeply human in the way that government often struggles to be. You are not a supplement to what the city does. In many ways, you are the heart of it. Yet government has not always made it easy for you to do what you do. Permitting processes that take too long, rules that seem designed to frustrate rather than enable, bureaucratic friction that costs time, energy, and money that you don't have. That has to change. We want to make it easier, genuinely easier, for partner groups and individuals to continue doing the great work that you do, because your energy should be spent on your communities, not on navigating city bureaucracy. That's my job. And before I depart, I want to tell you about my other job, being a parent to 2 kids who are growing up in the same borough I did. Children who, at 1 and 3, found safe spaces to run in Prospect Park during scary lockdown days, and who now, years later, practice baseball and learn to roller skate on the recently renovated blacktop at Greenwood Playground. I share this to say that parks are personal. They're beloved monuments to our best times and silent companions during our worst. So I'm proud to be here as the deputy mayor with the privilege of overseeing the Parks Department, and as a New Yorker who knows what it really means when we say parks are our backyards. I look forward to working with each of you in pursuit of green, growing open spaces, and I thank you for all that you do to contribute to our communities. Thank you.
Can I get one more round for Deputy Mayor Kerson? Thank you so much. Such an encouraging, inspiring way to start the morning. And I want to keep that energy going. But first, let me just briefly mention who I am. I'm Eli Dvorkin, the Editorial and Policy Director at the Center for an Urban Future, and who's joining me today. I'm so thrilled to have this incredible panel together to help us dig through these issues and opportunities in a little bit more depth. So I'll just briefly mention who's on the stage with me, and then we'll get right into the conversation. I'm joined today by Heather Lubov, the Executive Director of City Parks Foundation, Meera Joshi, the former Deputy Mayor for Operations for New York City and the President of the Greenwood Cemetery, Alan Van Capel, Executive Director of Friends of the High Line, Ya-Ting Liu, former Chief Public Realm Officer for New York City and Chief of Staff and Director of Strategy at NYU Tandon School of Engineering, and Tim Tompkins, Senior Fellow at the Center for an Urban Future, as well as a Fellow at the NYU Mellon Institute, and several other hats. I just can't get into all of them right now. But please join me in a round of applause for our panelists. We're so grateful to have you here. You know, I was thinking as the Deputy Mayor was speaking that we obviously want to dig into the challenges, the problems, the issues that we need to still solve for in New York City. But I think we could all use some good news these days, not least of which because of Stefan Castle, but for many reasons. And I'd like to say that maybe this conversation can actually begin with some of the good news. So why don't I just open it up to all of you, whoever wants to jump in first. When we think about the power of public-private partnerships to support our public realm, our parks, our open spaces, our plazas, our streets, what's working? Can you give me an example of where you see the potential or the reality right now that's actually living up to that promise? And I'm thinking a little bit about what Jonathan was saying earlier, that we are a city that has been as innovative when it comes to public-private partnerships as anywhere in the world. As former Parks Commissioner Adrian Benepi mentioned to me earlier, it was a public-private partnership that gave rise to the first playground in America at Seward Park. We've been a pioneer when it comes to the conservancy model that other cities have borrowed, stolen, adopted from New York City. We've done innovative things, even just in the last few years, led by Meera, by Ya-Ting, in terms of creating stronger partnerships to support our public realm beyond our parks. So give me a little sense from all of you. When you look out at the landscape of New York City, despite the very real challenges that we're going to get into, where do you see these powerful examples of promise or what's possible? What's inspiring to you right now when it comes to public-private partnerships for open space?
I'll jump in with, this may not totally fit the definition of public-private partnerships, but it's certainly an area where we see growing interest in supporting green space because it's doing more than being green space. So now we have more interested stakeholders, and that's our climate work. So everywhere we have green space that's doing two things. It's mitigating stormwater, it's a retention wall, and it's public space. We suddenly have two streams of funding and two groups of stakeholders that are interested in it. And I look at, one of the places that I am haunted by in New York City is Jewel Street. It's an area that's still on septic tanks. But there's a world in which that can turn into green infrastructure and provide green space for that neighborhood and stop the eternal flooding that they live with every day.
I'll jump in and say we talk about what the robust conservancy world looks like, but we've actually quantified that recently. So there are about 50 or so conservancies. Just those 50 are bringing in more than $300 million in private support to supplement public dollars going into the park system, and 75,000 volunteers. So I think, there's an enormous contribution that those public-private partnerships are bringing to the table. Now, there's all sorts of downsides to that. There's a lot of equity issues that we need to address, but the sheer magnitude of the work that's being done is incredible.
I'll say that something that I think we were really excited about is that 2 years ago on the High Line, we built two connector bridges, a woodland bridge and a connector bridge, and that was really a public-private partnership. It was with the state, not the city, but the state put in $20 million. Brookfield Properties put in $20 million. Friends of the High Line put in $10 million. And then we maintain that property with a fund that comes from the state. And that for us has been enormously successful because we saw a need and we couldn't do it by ourselves, and we marshaled together the business community that had a direct interest because of Manhattan West in that area, and the state. And now you can leave Moynihan Train Hall, cross one avenue, and then on a gradual incline, ascend onto the High Line and walk all the way down to the West Village without ever stepping on a city block. And we're seeing the commuting patterns change because now people are walking to work because they can, as opposed to hopping in a bus or hopping in a subway.
I'll go into just what we see on the day-to-day that maybe go unnoticed. I think there are business improvement districts all throughout the city that do sort of a real yeoman's work of the maintenance and operations of our commercial districts, which I think are really key for a vitality of any neighborhood. And then there are just community-based organizations, especially over the last 4 years. I see them here in the audience, Rosa Chang with Gotham Park, and 34th Avenue Open Street and Paseo Park. And those two come to the fore as examples of what happens when government actually embraces a community-led vision and idea of what a public space can be. So I think all throughout the city, in addition to the wonderful examples that were mentioned, there's just so many of the public-private partnerships just happening organically. And of course, we can't not mention just the extreme sort of outpouring of New Yorkers in all of the public spaces from the Knicks, in the finals and the playoffs. Like every nook and cranny is occupied, and there's this like really amazing blend of just neighbors and also local businesses just coming together in this real sort of celebration. And I think it's an example of what happens in all the great public spaces in the city, what it can kind of create, and that chemistry that results in just people coming together.
I think one of the amazing sources of hope constantly is just going out into communities where people, whether it's in open streets or a neighborhood park, New Yorkers never give up. And what I loved about the deputy mayor's comments was about, it's personal and the passion of people who say, look, okay, things aren't what I want, and I'm just going to step up and do something about that. And that's been the spirit. The New Yorkers just aren't going to sit and wait. And you saw it whether it was, outdoor dining during COVID, where it's just let us loose and let us do our thing. Another source of hope is that something has been happening, partially because of the work of Meera and Ya-Ting, where the different public space constituencies are talking to each other across transportation and streets, parks, gardens, and bids who manage public spaces. That makes it feel like it's more of a movement, and people are seeing these common challenges, but also these common opportunities. And the other thing is, I loved the comments that the deputy mayor made, because there's a couple things that the new administration is doing. The Office of Mass Engagement is about how are we going to engage. It's not just about raising money in every corner of the city. It's about engaging people. And how, not so much what can they do for parks or public spaces, but how can parks and public spaces be a resource for them, which is a different way of thinking about things. And then, but also saying, hey, look, at the charter level, at the legal level, like there's some bigger stuff we need to do to empower entities. And that's sort of thinking, bottom up and top down, which is great.
Well, I love that, Tim. I want to pick up on that theme and maybe talk about both the top down and the bottom up in all of this. When I think about where we still have work to do, I think a lot of it has to do with the bottom up, enabling organizations from, all volunteer groups, activists, community activists, to, nonprofits with a small but not $0 budget, all the way through to larger organizations to be able to do more of what they already want to be doing. But I'd love to hear you all help me think through a little bit. What's getting in the way of that right now? Given all this energy that you all are talking about, the fact that we've got thousands of organizations from the very, very small to the quite large that are committing to doing this work, arguably more than ever in many parts of the city, unleashed by the impact of the pandemic, where New Yorkers felt more than ever this compelled to help actually take care of our public realm, which was the lifeline for all of us during those dark times. And I often say it's the one good thing that came out of that incredibly dark time was this reawakening of New Yorkers' passion for our public realm. But we also know that it's very challenging to actually do that work, to be able to turn to the city of New York and say, we're going to raise dollars independently to take care of public space for free. And, seemingly a pretty good pitch, to the city of New York. And I think many organizations feel like that pitch is received with obstacles. So help us understand, what are the challenges that are inhibiting those partnerships from being more sustainable? What gets in the way? And I'm looking a little bit at you. Okay, go ahead, Tim. No, say more. Go ahead.
Lawyers. No, I mean, really, I think fundamentally there's a series of obstacles in terms of a lot of procedural things where the approach is not have you been our partner for 10 years, and how can we, and do we believe that these partnerships and community involvement is a good thing? And if so, are we going to enable and incentivize them? Instead, it's sort of a risk management approach, literally in Corp Counsel, risk management division, calling the shots about these things. And, sometimes a relationship analogy is good. It's kind of like you've been in a relationship for 10 years and one partner says, I'd like to get a little more serious. Then the other partner does what Donald Trump says and says, sure, but can you sign this 150-page prenup first? And by the way, it's going to take about 2 years to negotiate it because my lawyers are very busy with other things. That is, in many ways, the way the city approaches the relationship. And we can flip that around, and I can talk a little later about how to flip that around.
Yeah, I mean, just to build on that, that's what I saw in my 4 years in City Hall with this sort of inaugural role, trying to really focus on what are the kind of process changes that we can make in city government to reduce the friction. And I think it starts with, and it's amazing to hear Deputy Mayor Kerson really kind of tee it up and frame it well. So it's going to be, keep the pressure up on this administration to actually execute. But the first is acknowledging that the city of New York needs partners in order to maintain and activate our public spaces throughout the city, right? So you have to start with this thing of like, we actually need these partnerships. And then the second is, if you acknowledge that, what is the desired outcome? And it should be, let what Tim was saying, let's reduce the friction and make these partnerships as easy as possible, reduce the barriers to entry, right? You shouldn't have to hire a legal team and a lawyer to go through all the different legal documents that different agencies are requiring of you, right? So that's like the second step. And then the third, the deputy mayor referenced this, that a lot of the processes, so this is the thing I also realized, like people in city government don't wake up and say, oh, I know, let me add 10 more processes to make all of this more difficult. So just to kind of put myself in their shoes too, it's like this outcome of, I think, a lot of sort of lawyers writing the processes from, again, risk mitigation, risk avoidance, and all of a sudden, everybody's left with, all the, different documents, different rules being bounced around to different agencies to do different things. So there is a tremendous opportunity, I think, with the mayor's new commission to really take a look at how do you kind of just remove all of this and start from a blank slate. So there's a real opportunity, I think, ahead of us to do, really significant operational change on the muck and the sort of Byzantine nature of processes in city government that's sitting on top of all of these opportunities.
I think muck is a technical term in this, and just building. And I think we almost have to set the framework, right? If you think about it, the financial crisis of the 70s came, and the Parks Department today, in 2026, still does not have the staffing levels it had in 1974. So just sit with that for a moment, right? And think, so when, and I love the folks at the Parks Department, right? Because they are exceedingly hardworking. And the image I always come up with in my mind is like Lucy and Ethel in the chocolate factory. They keep on coming and coming. Well, go to the folks that have to issue the permits, that have 27,000 permits that they have to issue. And then when you have a different event that does not fit the same mold, and their first reaction is no, true story with us at the High Line, I was pissed. And I was like, why are they saying no? There's an ability for us to earn $1 million if we do this and this from this corporate activation. And this is a really good thing. It was Lululemon. We did it last year. They wanted to do a fun run on the High Line, and they said, we'll give you $500,000 for a rental fee and $500,000 for a corporate sponsorship. And the very first reaction, they came to us July 1st of last year, the first reaction was no, it can't happen. And our team was like, okay, I guess we can't do this. And I was like, no, it's $1 million. And that doesn't happen every day. And it took us till literally 2 days before the event in order to get everything done. Do you know when I think some of it moved? When we actually said to the folks on the call in the Parks Department, hey, we just really want to say we're sorry that we're giving you all this extra work to do, because you still have all of this other stuff that's piled up. And so that becomes a complication. And I believe, as we think forward, that, we've heard successive administrations talk about getting to 1%. And my sincere hope is that we get there in this administration. But I think until we get there, we need to declare a parks emergency. And I think what we have to do is we have to identify the 5 to 10 single largest barriers in allowing us to raise money. And until the city does what it should do, which is to fund our parks adequately, we should take the reins off of anybody who wants to help get that money and drive them into our local parks and communities.
I don't want to pile on, but here goes. I think at the core, the city it insures itself. So that's exactly how the city approaches all of these questions about how much risk do we take. And on top of that, you have everything that's ever gone wrong. And every time something goes wrong, there's another check mark that somebody at the Parks Department has to look at to make sure that that bad thing never happens again. What is really exciting about what I hear from the Deputy Mayor and from the Mamdani administration is you have two things happening at once, which is dedicating the funds, which I would argue in and of itself doesn't get you there, because money can be spent foolishly or it can be spent wisely. So 1% on its own means nothing without the tools on how to spend it wisely. But on the second thing is what the Deputy Mayor referred to is looking at the processes. And I would also encourage the use of what Bloomberg loved to pilot, right? He just piloted everything. But it's a great way to say, those are all the rules. Don't worry, we're not messing with the rules. But we're just going to try this one thing, right? And that becomes the new norm. It's another way. So in procurement, we try challenge-based procurements, where we look at the problem versus the procurement specs. And I think in parks, when it comes to partners, it's that same sort of challenge that we should be looking at. Not does this partner meet all of these requirements, but is the thing that we need being solved by this partner? And if it's yes, then we're allowed to go forward. And I think once you flip it from what are all the things that could go wrong to what's the likelihood that things will go wrong, then you open up a lot more freedom for the city to act as a whole.
Well, I love that vision, Meera, and I guess I want to ask you all a little bit more about how we get there. And Alan, you put out a big idea for how we get there, the sort of state of emergency where we suspend many of the rules that are inhibiting these kinds of partnerships from taking root or from thriving. I'd love to kind of drill down a little bit in terms of what does that actually look like? And maybe I'll start with you again, Alan, but I'd love everybody's thoughts about this. You mentioned in general, or Tim mentioned earlier, the lawyers. I'd love to kind of talk about what are some of those specific issues that end up being the reason why the approach ends up being no. Talking about revenue, talking about insurance, talking about other issues. Maybe you can give us a couple examples and we can start to unpack what are we actually saying no? Why are we saying no?
I think a perfect example would be we have we're in the middle of a conversation about a plaza adjacent to the High Line, where I think our intention, we piloted it. Last year it was 18th Street. It was 18th Street Plaza at 18th and 10th, and we piloted. The city had said we want you to take it over. We said we'd never really run a streetscape before, and so we just want to see how it does. We'll take care of the plantings and we'll keep everything clean, and then we'll figure out if we want to own it. And now I realize, we should just fold this into our existing maintenance and operations agreement. But the only reason why I would do that is if I could monetize that for the community, right? If I could then use that as a concession space that we could rent out, make money for, and then funnel it back into the conservancy. And this should be easy because we've done this. It is a 6-week process from start to finish. And our friends at the Parks Department said, and I believe this, with sorrow in their voice, this will take over a year to do, and because there is this, and the process itself is a 6-week process. So for me, it's then what's the issue, and for there it's a staffing issue. They said we just don't have the staff to spend on these issues, but then it has to sit with the law department, and then it has to sit our department, then the law department, then this one over here, then it has to go through the franchise concessions committee. There was all these levels, and I'm just thinking to myself, we've been operating this park for 15 years. We have this experience. But that, for me, is now a year that Friends of the High Line can't monetize that space. So I just see wasted money. going out the door. I see all this opportunity for us to be able, and that's less money that I can put in New York City public classrooms because we put teaching artists in New York City classrooms. That's less art offline that I can do because we bring our artists into public spaces like public hospitals and New York public libraries and other spaces where we create murals and stuff for folks. All the things we do off the park, that money helps support, and those neighborhoods then will have a harder time getting those resources.
I'll jump in and I'll speak sort of broadly and then specifically. And I second or third or fourth what everyone has said here, that every person that I interact with at the Parks Department cares deeply about the work that they do. And I don't think anyone wants to say no, honestly. And I've been on phone calls with people who have had to say no, who then get yelled at. It's not their fault. I'm like, look, someone finally said, I'm just a public servant here doing what I am supposed to be doing. It doesn't mean that I'm loving what I'm doing. So I just want to preface it with that. I think what we have found, at least from the members of the Parks and Open Space Partners Coalition, which is around 50 nonprofit stewardship organizations, primarily conservancies, although City Parks Foundation is one member and we are not a conservancy, is that the primary challenges that people face are insurance requirements, license agreements, and permitting. Those are the big ones. Very specifically to City Parks Foundation, just two examples, I think, because we actually operate we operate two programs jointly with the Parks Department, Partnerships for Parks and the Swedish Cottage Marionette Theater. Within Partnerships for Parks, we have a city-paid staff person sitting next to a privately paid staff person who are doing the same job, working together, and they cannot share files, literally. They can't look at each other's calendars, they can't work on the same document at the same time, and we can't use their software. So you have 40 people all working together who literally cannot communicate with one another. And for the life of me, I don't understand this one. You can be an intern working for the Parks Department for a month and get an email address, but people who have been doing this for 20 years cannot. So that, I think, is just one challenge. And that's not the Parks Department's fault. It's the IT department, whatever it's called now. Do it, I guess, or whatever. But then the sort of much broader example is at the Swedish Cottage, where we've been co-managing with the agency for, 30 years, 25 years. And we charge, $500 or $800 for a family to have a birthday party before a puppet show. And we had to stop because we don't have a license agreement, and we haven't had a license agreement in 25 years, and everything's been fine. But suddenly we can't do that anymore because you can't collect revenue if you don't have a license agreement. So we had to stop. We used that money to pay for part-time puppeteers to go out on the puppet mobile for free. And we can't do that anymore because we don't have the revenue coming in. That's just cutting off your nose to spite your face. And it's nobody's fault, but it's ridiculous.
Thank you, Heather. Well, yeah, you could hear the audience's reaction. How dare you send these puppets out into the community? You brought up a couple of really important points about revenue, and we've been writing about alternative dedicated revenue for parks now for a couple of years. I think we've gotten some real interest, and obviously, Meera, we spoke to your team about this at some length, about this idea of how can parks, hold on to the revenue that it generates, and parks does generate about $50 million a year in revenue, but Parks doesn't hold on to that money. It goes right back into the city's general fund. And then there are all these partner organizations, and some have the ability with a license agreement to hold on to the revenue, and many others don't. There's such an uneven landscape that, Tim, you've been writing about. One of the ideas that we put forward was this idea of a Parks Improvement Trust. Create a new entity that can be the dedicated recipient of revenue streams. A variety of different options. We've talked about revenue from real estate, creating and capturing value from real estate. We talked about the idea of a small surcharge for tickets sold at stadiums that are actually located on parkland, like Citi Field and the U.S. Tennis Center and Yankee Stadium. But the good news there is there's lots of options. We put forward about 24 of them for where the revenue could come from. The challenge is an entity like a Parks Improvement Trust that can hold on to that revenue. But there's also all the challenges that parks groups and open space groups face in terms of just having agreements that would allow them to generate revenue. So Tim, I wanted to kind of ask your thoughts about how do we solve for that? What are some of the models or solutions that seem most valuable? And especially because you've been so focused on this, how do we make sure that those kinds of partnerships can have an equitable impact on the city? So it's not just more dollars in the best resourced communities, but more dollars in communities that actually have the greatest unmet needs.
Thanks for that. I think another context setter is Citizens Budget Commission did a resident survey of how people felt about their parks. And the number of people in the Bronx who said that their parks were in poor in 2025, in fair or poor condition was 62%, I believe. 62%. The number in Manhattan was 29%. That's the context. And it's wonderful to have 1,000 volunteer not-for-profit partnerships pop up. But if the city doesn't have a set of intentions about how to address the disparities at the same time, if we're in a fiscal crisis again, those inequities will only increase. And the solution is not to stop people from stepping up and doing things for the parks they love. It's doing more to allow everybody else to do more and providing some extra things. So for instance, almost every one of these mechanisms for capturing revenues, for having the city indemnify a partner, they exist. Sometimes they exist within the parks world. Other cases they exist in DOT, where the DOT Plaza agreements say a partner can keep the revenues. So these exist. So one solution would be just do a survey of the most empowering and enabling tools with respect to insurance, which is the city indemnifies the partner, with respect to revenues, concessions, sponsorships, fundraising, and say the partner can keep it, and other licensing and permitting things. Put it into a simplified 10-page license and make those things under the emergency declaration or the pilot, make those things the default for any organization that has been for 10 years, not necessarily raising money, but activating their park, because that's also as important as raising money. And second of all, to address the equity issue, what we propose is a kind of indexed match. So in those neighborhoods that are below the median household income, half the places in the city, have the city provide a match for not just money raised, but also to put a dollar value on activation. Places like Seattle do that, where they say, we're going to put a dollar value on these in-kind contributions. And why don't we do like they do why don't we level the field like they do in campaign finance and have an index match, a 5-to-1 match in the lowest quintile neighborhoods in terms of income for what those efforts are, and do that as a way of incentivizing and rewarding the amazing work that people are doing. And people say, well, the city can't do that, but there's mechanisms where the city does micro grants. Now through a new tool with the Citizens Committee, there's mechanisms across the city and beyond parks where all of these things have been done. And if the city just says, we're going to pick those best practices and do it for our most trusted partners, then we can really start to turn things around.
I love that, Tim. And to your point about there are these models already, our previous report that we did together showed the Hudson Yards Infrastructure Corporation, which was created by the city, not by the state, to be able to capture revenue, to be able to reinvest in the extension of the 7 line, to pay that back and invest locally in that part of Midtown, had about $400 million in revenue last year. Parks Department has a $650 million budget. So in just a couple of square miles of Manhattan, we're seeing the potential for that kind of value capture, but we haven't applied it across the city. And I want to ask you, Ya-Ting, because you were sort of invoked a little bit in talking about, hey, it's not just parks, but it's the models that we have that are actually working for our plazas and other parts of the public realm. There was some real innovation that you spearheaded in your time as the Chief Public Realm Officer. Can you help us understand what's really working there? I mean, when Tim's talking about the models that are actually working or approaches that the city's taking that have made it easier, and part of the frustration that some organizations have is, well, they've got it pretty good and it's not working for us. But help us understand a little bit better what is working. I mean, what are those models that maybe even the parks world should be adapting or adopting from what has actually started to work better for our streets partners?
Yeah, I'll share an anecdote. for one of the first things that came across my desk when I was at City Hall is when, and it sort of ties in a lot of themes that were mentioned about sort of indemnification and the sort of like the heavy lawyering up process that I think partners sort of are usually greeted with when trying to interact with the city. So some of the Manhattan bids, so these are the wealthiest bids. They're all lawyered up, they have outside counsel, all of that, approached City Hall and said, you know, we are doing, we are spending a lot of our budget increasingly on the insurance requirements that the city is making us take out as a result of the current plaza agreements that we have. And it took a year and a half of like monthly calls between lawyers at the law department, at DOT, at City Hall, to just try to right size the risk and say, hey, as a city, instead of asking the bid to take on all the liability for what takes place in a plaza, the bids were just asking for, let us take on liability and responsibility for the things we do, right? So if we have planters out and one of our workers leave, glass shards in there and a passerby cuts their hand, okay, we're responsible for that. But everything else, like the city, take on. That's all they were asking for, and that took a year and a half. And that was.
We had a celebration.
I think so. Yeah. And the thing is, and I'll just say this: like it had to go all the way up to the mayor for a mayoral decision. And so I go into detail on all of that to say, in terms of what works and what can work, it is this sort of like you're in the belly of the beast of this bureaucracy. And it really does require this sustained, dogged, unrelenting focus from the inside to move these issues. It's not more complicated than that. I don't have some like magic formula that like we need this and we need this. The truth is, like in the morass, you need a dedicated team, whether it's at the agencies or at the different units within City Hall. The truth is, city government is top down. It is. And so to move all of these big ideas that we've talked about, whether, again, it's the emergency declaration or it's all of these incredible sort of like recommendations you all have for increasing revenue and schemes and funds and all of that stuff, unless it's sort of really prioritized from the mayor on down, it's really hard to kind of move the bureaucracy. And so the bid liability for plaza agreements, that was like this game changer. And again, Eli, it was exactly what you said. Like once the word got out that there was this handful of Manhattan bids that figured out how to sort of right size the liability, it sort of the word spread out, and then I think the park groups got wind of it too, and then everybody wanted to sort of get in on the action because they saw that as a way to, again, reduce the costs on their own costs of doing these kind of partnerships. And so yeah, it's not sexy. None of this is sexy, frankly. It is just kind of, you need an unrelenting, dogged focus on this because, again, every day, I think in city government, in City Hall, there's like 1,000 fires and issues that you're responding to. It's a very reactive environment. So unless there's a team that is focused on the prize and just like with blinders on these issues, it's hard. I think, 4 years come and go and you're just like, oh, like where do we move the needle on some of these big kind of policy questions?
And I'd like to say, I mean, it was like an epic change. But it's also a tiny piece of a large octopus of a structure, which also leads me to feel that we're best often pulling back and saying, like, let's not tangle with the octopus. Let's figure out other ways where we can get exclusive funding that are, for the vast, largely irreversible. They're maintained for long periods of time, and they're really easy. that gets you back to a lot of the land use things, right? Because those are areas where you can, and the city has been successful in the past, in a moment when a builder wants more, you have an opportunity to extract some permanent exclusive funding for public space or park space, even if it's not adjacent. The city has a ton of leverage. I look at Auburn East and the Rockaways. That was an instance where they had to build a nature preserve before they could build any housing. Those are really important moments because that doesn't take like death by 1,000 paper cuts, that reforming the licensing and permitting and all those other processes, but it does get you some of the same result. And I think there's lots of potential for the city to really go to developers, especially where we're looking to develop city-owned property, and say, start an endowment so that there's permanent maintenance funding for X park that all of your folks are going to benefit from, and the price that you're going to set is going to be based on this proximity. And then you have this exclusive nature because it will be directed. It's easy because hopefully they invest it wisely, and it's continuous. And I want to get back to the exclusive one because you can do a ton of work on raising funds, and whether it's concessions or tickets, it does all go to the general pot, and there are so many needs for the city. And I'm going to look at Julia like, you can't have any favorite children, right? Like, you've got to argue for all of them. And so the idea of understanding parks as a place that exclusive funding is really important because it is infrastructure, so it has to have regular maintenance, it has to have regular investment. I think that's one of the ways you move the needle in a large way, because the wins on some of the process they're a tremendous amount of work, and if you were like calculating the hours spent and the reward for the change, I'm not sure that they all balance out.
First of all, I do think that with respect to some of those value capture ideas related to real estate, I mean, you talked about the IBX being built and the opportunity in a previous report. We wrote about the opportunity we just do ahead of time what we saw with the High Line, where an infrastructure investment is made. Everybody knows that if a park goes from non-existent or becoming something vibrant, you're creating real estate value along the approximate way, alongside it. And so there's mechanisms throughout the country, and in some cases we've done here, like the number 7 line, where those investments, a portion of that incremental tax revenue is put back into maintaining that asset that creates that value. So there are some ways in which you can say it doesn't all have to go to the general fund, because there's a logical argument for that investment. The other thing I'd just say about the the wins on those process things, I mean, that was a big win on the bid thing, but that battle was won in the 1980s with Bryant Park and with the Central Park Conservancy being indemnified. There just has to be someone at the top of government who says, keep it simple and do it this way because we value that. So it doesn't have to be months and months of negotiations. If you start with take the most enabling and empowering tools and apply them everywhere. And because what happens when you don't? The Bronx River Alliance got a lot of philanthropy to build the River House. It's an amazing asset. It was going to open in 2020. And there were going to be people who were privately paid for, who were going to be science educators in that Bronx River House. And the city wouldn't let them go into the building to start doing science classes because the Bronx River Alliance, which had a budget of $1.5 million, city has $125 billion budget, wouldn't indemnify the city. That's what happens. That's why you have, 62% of the people in the Bronx saying fair and poor parks and 29% in Manhattan, because you have these different systems that drive those inequities and disparities.
What I'll also just add is, one, first of all, you mentioned the Hudson Yards as throwing off $400 million. There's a real choice point now in the city because there's an agreement that still has one more step through the New York City IDA to go through that will allow related companies to take that pilot money, payment in lieu of tax, to create that money that they're kicking off that goes into the city treasury, and that will go into a pilot to pay for the decking for the other side of the rail yards, which I think that private developer should be able to finance themselves, because the city in a financial crisis should not lose $400 million. That should be going into our park system. So that's number one. Number two, we created with the city the Highline Improvement Fund when Chelsea Market was created, and the zoning around that kicks off money that is supposed to pay for the infrastructure repair. It's a great idea. It's been helpful, but it's not perfect. And so we need to be able to have better agreements about how that money got spent, because there was a time when $9 million of those dollars got moved to something that did not actually benefit the Highline, right? And so we want to make sure when we create those things, we're writing them in such a way. I will say that, the topic, as I was thinking about private partnerships and how we encourage businesses to come in, when I started this morning saying that we are still not at the pre-fiscal crisis of the 70 staffing levels in the park, that creates really two problems. I talked about the first one, but the second problem it causes is if our parks are not funded appropriately, no private business is funding them. And no private business is going to give money to redo a park in a neighborhood if they don't have confidence that park is going to be maintained. It just isn't. I live on the Lower East Side. We had a big renovation of a small park, which was considered one of the worst in the city, Gulick Park, and it doesn't have a permanent maintenance crew. And so it looked beautiful for 6 months, but we have a mobile crew that comes and takes care of it. And so that investment is depreciating much faster than it should. And private businesses have zero interest in giving money to something that the city itself has not said is a priority. And the only way you know that it's a priority is if they put the money in the budget. That's the proof that it's a priority. And until the city makes those real investments, I think it's going to be hard to find real corporations in New York to feel like they're going to make an investment in a park, because they're going to ask the question, how are you planning to maintain this investment? How are you planning to make sure this preserves for the community? And if there isn't a strong answer for that, I think it's going to be hard for them to make that investment. So I think what would be great is if the city announced a challenge that said, we are going to increase the funding for parks, but we're going to do so if we could identify this amount of money additionally. Brad Hoyleman's doing this right now in the arts community, where he said, you have a $250,000 grant to do your arts and cultural program, but we want to match that, and that we want you to find funding for that. You'll get that if you found funding. I found funding for that, right? And now it's $250,000 new dollars that we wouldn't have had for arts and culture because I was able to match it with city money. It's similar to your 5-to-1 match, but there's a way to do it with corporations as well. And I also think we have these conversations with each other. We have these conversations with parks people in bars talking about how depressed we are. But we don't actually have these conversations with New York City business leaders, right? To bring them into the room. We don't have this conversation with the New York City Partnership on parks and green spaces and open spaces. And I'll take responsibility. I'm the treasurer of ABNY. We haven't had a conversation about this at ABNY in a real substantive way to be thinking about this. And I think if we're going to talk about a tri-sector approach, about how you do this work, we have to figure out who are going to be our evangelists in the corporate community. Who cares about this? We are going to see a generational shift of wealth in this country with AI and the IPOs. There's going to be more money that's going to be available, and these folks are not philanthropic. They haven't had a chance to do it yet, and we should be setting the table to figure out how this next great wave of philanthropy is directed towards open space and parks. And the message around doing it is that these are the small d democratic places. You don't have to purchase anything or perform. You could be social, you could be solitary. Nobody asks how you voted in the election. Nobody asks how you think about this issue, right? You just show up. These are the new town squares. And I think when we ask for 1%, and we say that's what we want, we've lost out of the gate, because it feels so small and so defeatist to so many people. Our asks have to match what we actually need.
I think there's I think a lot about this because of the New York City Green Fund, which we administer, and how at an emergency, we put that fund together in less than 2 months during COVID, and because there was this critical need to keep parks open and to support the nonprofits that work in those parks, and funders came together to make that happen. Like that, we got checks out the door before June 30th of 2020. And when I look back at that, I think that was just insane. And how did we do that? But it's possible. And so then I think about, I spent many, many years at the New York Public Library, and parks and libraries are very similar. So, and I think about what's the difference and why is it that the New York Public Library can raise so much private money? And it's because they were set up originally as public-private partnerships, and they are nonprofit organizations that can advocate for themselves. The park system cannot do that, and there has been no real organized structure to have the conversation that Alan has been talking about, which I wholeheartedly support. So, and when I think about the libraries had the exact same issues in the 1970s, even though they were not city agencies, they are nonprofits, but they were able to organize around every single branch library, and every branch still, I assume to this day, has a group of advocates arguing for that branch. And it's organized by the library itself, the Budget Action Committee. And, there is no similar structure for parks because it's not possible for the agency to do that itself. So we've started to pick that up through the Parks and Open Space Partners, but that's a small group. So I think we need someone to organize, to fundraise, whether that's the Green Fund doing it or someone else. We're not set up to do that. We could, we haven't been. But I think until we fix that structural problem, we're not going to see the same kind of success. And the other thing I think about when I compare us to the libraries is that in the 1970s, you had Mrs. Astor, who spoke up and went to Ed Koch and said, this is not acceptable. And we don't have anyone like that. There was an article that I read on the subway down here in the Stanford Innovation, whatever it's called, about how there are philanthropists, but there are no civic leaders. And I feel like that's what we're missing right now, is that civic leader to stand up and say, this is not acceptable. Mr. Mayor, please do something about this. And then businesses will follow. I've spoken to the New York City Partnership, and I went with the Parks Commissioner, but that's not the same as going with the mayor.
And I think the libraries, they have the ability to close their doors. So when funding's getting tight, they're like, all right, kids, no Saturday, Sunday, right? Like they have something that they can very visibly take away from the public. And the parks, one, they're always open. And two, I think oftentimes we're not always talking about them in a way that everybody can relate to. Like we all may use parks and playgrounds and rec centers, but we just tend to kind of talk about parks and green space, and I think we lose a lot of the audience when we do that. And I would often think about it as, if we don't have people maintaining the parks, Johnny can't use the bathroom after 4 o'clock. Like, that's true. The bathrooms are locked up, the playground's done. And I think it's those moments that really help propel the issues. If we have a mayor who's been really, steadfast on affordability, making sure everybody in New York can live here and have a quality of life that is the reason why everybody looks at New York and wants to be here, because of the diversity and the amazing, assets we have. But really pinpointing what that pain point means for a family that doesn't have open space, that doesn't have a playground, that brings it home. Not being able to get to work because the bus is going to be late, you can feel that tension. But we have to really be able to describe what it means to a family in the Bronx that doesn't have a playground to take the kids after school, that doesn't have safe green space, not just to give the kids a place to go, but the mental health benefits and the actual health benefits. And they are talking about sponsorship. I mean, insurance companies should be pitching in a lot for the amount of work that parks do to help people. It's incredible.
Can I just jump in with just building on that? I mean, another thing I think for all of us to kind of consider, this idea of like communication and really translating, and that this is what Mayor Mondani has done extraordinarily well, is take sort of like really complicated policy things and just distill it down in a way that every New Yorker can understand. What does it mean for their day-to-day life? So something I've been thinking about is sort of like, you know, is 1% for parks the right rally cry anymore going forward? Now, don't get me wrong, Alan, I couldn't agree more. Like, money is real. Like, there's just nuts and bolts of like the bodies on the ground to do this frontline work. But I think from a messaging perspective, like what is the vision for how like materially New Yorkers everywhere will change their experience? Like what can they feel? Like what is the end state we're trying to get to? You know, every bathroom working, you know, water fountain working, you know, up to grade playgrounds, you know, whatever it is. I feel like that as a communication sort of strategy might resonate more than just calling for 1%.
I think there's a real value in broadening the conversation and the terminology of what we're talking about. One is very, very important to think and talk about the recreation part of Parks and Recreation. Because and sometimes when we talk about just raising money, we're not expressing what we all know, that is to bring a public space to life. It's not just about it being maintained, that when people activate it, you know, a sports, you know, a soccer league, a softball league, is bringing life to that space that makes it safer, that makes it, that is also creating social capital in a community and bringing people together. And there's an incredible set of things that happen from any kind of activation or activity in a park. And oftentimes, a huge part of the Parks and Recreation community isn't as fully engaged because people are like, oh, well, they're not raising money or planting flowers. And all the recreation groups are incredibly important for the life of the city, and parks are an asset for them. And then, you know, you talk about civic leadership. I do think that there's the seeds of this conversation coming from the mayor talking about an office of mass engagement. How do we engage people, you know, in a much broader way? Because the public spaces are where what is working or not working about our society, about our city, about capitalism itself is made manifest. And when they turn around, it's because people step up and get engaged. And, you know, if there can be a citywide campaign for WNYC, which I think, you know, this is facilities, you know, why can't there be one led by the mayor with community people, just like happened in the 70s in the fiscal crisis, where it's like, we're in deep shit, and we're going to be in deep shit fiscally, it seems. You know, the federal government, just like in the 70s, is abandoning us. And there's a lot of, you know, huge expenses on the horizon. But what combination of civic and political leadership can say, let's all engage every part of the open space community and raise some money where it's possible, incentivize and match that to address the very real disparities, and work together on this.
Well, I love that vision, Tim, and I wanted to ask you all a little bit more about some of the other specific ideas that could actually help the mayor and his team to realize more of this. And we talked a lot about some of the nuts and bolts of the bureaucracy, the process. I'm a wonk, so I could spend all day there, but I want to actually maybe turn to a couple other things too. And I think, you know, Meera, you said it. I mean, thinking about, could insurance companies actually be paying for some of the recreational programming that's happening in our parks? We put out a report just a few months ago about putting the rec back in Parks and Rec, really reinvesting in the rec side of the equation. And we showed in that report how, at the same time as the number of recreational programs in parks has fallen over 40% just since 2019, and that's a staffing challenge that the Parks Department faces. But there's also all of these recreational groups, nonprofits and local organizations that are actually doing that work on the ground with very little resources. How do we solve for that? So Tim, in our forthcoming report, you actually talk about the idea of tapping into healthcare dollars to help do this. Ya-Ting, I want to maybe get your thoughts about this too, because we see when we look at the landscape of where there may be support for this, I'm looking at anchor institutions like universities, like hospitals, and thinking about what's the next generation of public-private partnerships for parks and open space that tap those major partners of New York City. You all talked about what it would actually take to engage, the corporate community and to make the case that they should be more engaged on parks. I'd love to hear your thoughts about not just how do we get them there, but also what would that partnership look like? But maybe, Tim, I'll start with you around this idea about health, and then I'd love everybody's thoughts about other specific ideas where you could see some real potential, things that we maybe aren't doing yet today.
No, and this is something that Jonathan and Eli sort of, said, why don't we look into these relationships between hospitals? It's a huge part of the city's economy, 850,000 people in healthcare, 850,000 people working in healthcare, 62 hospitals, 300 community, urgent care centers. And they're in every community throughout the city. And also, not-for-profit hospitals have to meet a community benefit standard. They have to develop a community health needs. And so there's this very natural relationship between them having a community health plan and making an investment in activities that could be as simple as meditation and walking and yoga, or more active rec programs. And so if the city could come up with, and other cities have things like a Park RX program, where if you have diabetes or asthma in a certain community, then you can get a discount on rec centers, or there can be, they've done it with, this has happened a lot with sort of healthy foods, where a doctor will write a prescription for healthy foods, and then there's a voucher for being able to get healthy foods from a green market. That idea can spill over into active recreation as well. So if the city could come up with a package of recreation-related activities that insurers and local healthcare providers could say, yes, I'm going to sponsor that. It could be hiring a recreation associate in a park, or it could be hiring a vendor to activate programs, and then track that over time so that the healthcare providers can show that the investment in these recreation activities can meet and exceed their community health benefit plans, which helps them with regulators in terms of the standards they need to meet as not-for-profit hospitals.
Right, and reduces hospitalizations
Yeah.
and lowers costs ultimately. Yeah, I love that.
Can I jump in here for
Yeah,
a sec? I wholeheartedly agree that the corporate sector should be supporting parks. This is why your employees stay. It's where they live. It's where they're raising their families. But I do want to say, as the fundraiser in me, the corporate sector is like that much of what philanthropy looks like. And the Green Fund is paid for by foundations, by and large. And 80% of all philanthropy is just everyday people. So when we talk about raising private dollars for parks and open spaces, sure, we'll get some money from the corporate sector, and that's really important, but the corporate sector is fickle, and they're gonna move on to something else. So what's gonna get us real private dollars, if we're talking about philanthropy, is a citywide campaign to raise awareness for the need for private dollars for parks and open spaces. And that's gonna come from individuals, whether it's people in AI making that money, or however they're, wherever that money will be, that's what's gonna change, that's what's gonna make the difference in bringing in private philanthropy for parks.
I think that, yes, but it has to be met with overcoming sort of maybe broad, the sort of like suspension of disbelief. I mean, it's a little bit of what Alan was saying about sort of like, what do I see, what is the outcome? What am I gonna see result for my investment and my money? And so some of the things that I think is really exciting that the administration is working on are, for example, deploying modular restrooms. That's coming out. Different ways of just expediting the actual outcomes, again, that New Yorkers can materially feel and make a difference. So modular restrooms is something to try. I think, Cuff, you guys have talked about kind of concession kits and other types of concession stands. Like Governor's Island uses these amazing old shipping containers, right, where they can just like plop it down and it's all self-contained unit without, again, going through years of permitting processes and digging up, water and sewer lines and all that stuff that makes a project, quadruple in price. So I think the city, in addition to all of this sort of call for support, has to show that it can actually deliver results without, waiting 4 years. So like within, the first 4 years to really, again, be able to deploy projects and outcomes that everyone can feel.
Love it. Well, on those really thoughtful and helpful notes, I'd love to turn over to our audience for some other thoughtful, helpful notes of their own. So the way this is going to work today is we want to know your ideas for the next generation, unlocking the next generation of public-private partnerships for parks. If you have a question for one of our panelists, absolutely feel free to do that as well. We also welcome your ideas. The way it'll work, throw your hands up. My colleagues will come around with microphones. Please just let us know your name if you're here with an organization, and please do keep your idea or your question brief. I think we're going to get to a lot of them. So I see some hands up. We'll go to former Commissioner Benefee right in the middle, and we'll head over to the left, an orange hat, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
Hi. By the way, it's a fabulous panel, because everything I was going to say, you already said. I was thinking, Tim, your anecdote about the Bronx River, I was part of that discussion. It broke my heart. And they said, in the poorest congressional district in the country, the city is demanding that we indemnify the city, and they're not going to indemnify us. And I said to them, tell the city to go pound sand. But I didn't say go pound sand, because otherwise you're going to walk away from this. Now, they didn't. They blinked and knuckled under. But at the same time, community gardens are facing really onerous new rules. And I said the same thing to them. Tell them, screw you, we'll walk away. And the city blinked and said, okay, forget the rules. So I think there's a lot of power in these nonprofit partnerships. Like if the city had ever said to the Central Park Conservancy, we're no longer indemnifying you, you indemnify us, Central Park Conservancy would say, go pound sand, we're walking away. And the city would have blinked. So I think there's power in the groups really standing together and not letting the city pick off the poor and the weak, which is what they did at the Bronx River. I would say the key to all of this for the city is a lesson we learned long ago, really through the genius of Gordon Davis. And a lot of what all of you are doing today goes back to Gordon Davis, of really the most innovative of all the modern parks commissioners, which is you gain allies and power by losing power, by sharing power. And that's the big leap that everybody had to make, was I will give up some of my power to these organizations in order to have a better picture. And that's the whole secret. And what happens is administrations forget that lesson, and they tend to want to get back the power, take the power away from the park administrators, take the power away from these partners. There was a parks commissioner who once said to me, I won't name that person, these conservancies are a pain in my ass, and if I had my way, I'd get rid of them all. I looked at him and said, okay, go ahead and try. That's really the secret, I would say to all the members of this new administration. Understand, this has been going on for 50 years almost. You gain power by sharing power, and I think that's, indemnify everybody. That's the single most important thing you can do.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Hey, you can give the microphone right there to just keep it going. And yeah, great. Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm Dawn Siff with Alliance for Paseo Park in Jackson Heights, Queens, and thanks to Ya-Ting for shouting us out. There are a lot of activists who are really exhausted, and right? Are we tired? And we're excited and we're fired up. But again, at every turn, the city is saying to communities like ours in Jackson Heights, Queens, where we rank last in public space, our council district, the city is saying, oh, have a business improvement district. Oh, charge concessions. Like, I would like to see someone come and tell the tamale lady who's been operating at our farmers market for 15 years that she needs to pay them now. Like, there are these solutions that aren't necessarily going to work in our community. And we have taken a 26 block long open street with help from the Department of of transportation with help from our council member Krishnan. And we've made it into a park. We're pushing to make this into a linear park. But because open space is at such a premium, this space is being asked to solve every single problem at once. So it's becoming a moped highway. It's a place where seniors play bingo. We want it to be a green public space. And I really love Tim's idea that there's a sliding scale to give back to communities, because it reminds me of the COVID shacks. The COVID shacks in our neighborhood were shacks. And then we would come into Manhattan during the pandemic and we would see these incredible structures. And I thought, why isn't there a sliding scale to give the restaurants money for that? So it's the same thing with this public space. There needs to be a sliding scale to help communities in working class neighborhoods pay for this public space, and not just putting it back on all these old ideas that are barely working for Central Park and probably barely working for the High Line. I don't want to speak for you, but it sounds like it's barely working. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Yeah, go right back. You can just keep the microphone, pass it right behind you to Lynn, just to keep it going. And and then I see you
Hi, everybody.
in the back. Good, perfect. Thank you.
Sorry. Hi, everyone. I'm Lynn Bodner-Kelly from New York Restoration Project. I was struck by something you said, Ya-Ting, which is just how top-down government is. And it reminded me of a moment that I experienced. And Adrian, you were actually in the room, too. I had the benefit under the Bloomberg administration of leading the redevelopment of Coney Island. And there was a moment in time where then Deputy Mayor Doctoroff and the mayor called every single commissioner from any city agency that even remotely touched the project we were in the Blue Room at the time in City Hall. And I will never forget this as long as I live. The deputy mayor said, "This is important, make it happen." And he left the room. And you know what? It happened. So it's possible. So I say this both to bring hope, because I see that there is hope in this administration, and I ask and I implore those that are listening, that are stakeholders in this administration and decision makers, to please work with all of us, because we can make this happen. That's one example. And we've waited for other mayors to make it happen. Please, work with us. It can happen. Thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, I've got a hand there, and then we'll go over to the left side.
Hi, good morning. Morgan Monaco, president of the Prospect Park Alliance. Great panel. So excited and energized by this room. Just wanted to add a comment on how we're framing things. I really appreciate the comments that were made in terms of how are we making this as easy as possible for OMB to say yes, right? I mean, that's our job. It's incumbent upon us to try to articulate the real bottom line value for New Yorkers. And one other area that hasn't been mentioned is workforce, right? This administration cares deeply about labor and workforce, and I think that's an area that we have to really lean into in terms of, these are great union jobs. And there's an entire, nonprofit workforce that's supporting our parks and open spaces and our plazas. So I think that's just an area that we need to continue to lean into. And Alan, I agree, we've been a little too nice for too long. We have to toughen up. If there were a water main break on Canal Street, there's no Friends of Canal Street that comes in and fixes that, right? It's ridiculous, right? These are essential services, and we need to really make sure that it's not, please, sir, may I have some more? But this is an essential part of what it means to be in New York City.
Awesome. Thank you, Morgan. So yeah, I'll hand up on the left, and then we'll head back to the right. Back row, yep. Had your hand up, great.
Hi, thanks. I'm Jennifer Ratner. I'm the board chair of Friends of the East River Esplanade. And Esplanade Friends is the conservancy for the East Side Manhattan waterfront from East Harlem down to East Midtown. So I just want to thank everybody, because every frustration that you mentioned we've gone through every hoop and hurdle to activate and surprise and delight on our waterfront and raise money. And we have 3 healthcare institutions on our board, 2 or 3, and raised money and done wellness on the waterfront. But every little thing we do is a struggle. And so our fun fact is that Commissioner Shimomura started her parks career on our board about over 10 years ago, over a dozen years ago. And so I'm hoping, and as much as we love, and I, to the High Line to say how much we love the Parks Department and we think everything is great, and we do love all of our parks employees, but my idea is that things have to change culturally within the Parks Department, because I think what Commissioner Benepi said about these conservancies are a pain in my ass is really still an internal problem. I understand that it makes more work, but things like we wanted to pay for and put fantastic interpretive signage on the waterfront. People don't know who we are. In New York City, people move. If a Parks Conservancy that's been around for 15 years can't put permanent signage in the park to say this, Friends of the East River Esplanade or Esplanade Friends, how are people supposed to find out and then, give that 80% of our fundraising if they don't know who we are? So that's like a huge problem. We have people coming to us to put the signs on the benches, but guess what? Only certain Parks Conservancies have been grandfathered into that bench program, which makes people hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, makes Parks Conservancies hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, and we can't do it, even though we get inquiries all the time. We'd like to put a plaque on the bench. We just have to refer it back to the Parks Department. So, I think it's like a revolving thing, and the culture top down within the Parks Department has to change, that we're working together. We are events that draw thousands of people every year to the waterfront, thousands, should be advertised by the Parks Department without our having to go through, hoops and hurdles to do it. So I think that's where the change has to come, personally.
Thank you. All right, you have a microphone back there. Great.
Hi, thank you so much for the panel. My name is Kriti. I'm an urban designer at City Planning. And what are some ways that open space advocacy can be nested into the directive of Mamdani's affordability agenda? And how can we bring open space to the forefront with the housing crisis? There were some examples that were brought that was about creating open space like with housing and not having nexus and trying to create general funds to distribute funds for open space with housing. So any thoughts on that would be great.
I'd say housing alone is not necessarily helpful, right? It's building communities. And so building communities means you have space next to, our houses are small, right? So these are our living rooms, our dining rooms. They're more than just our backyards. In the summertime, we're eating meals out there. So I think as long as we're talking about building communities instead of just always talking about building housing, we wrap in all of the things that you need in addition to the actual housing. It goes for open space, but it also goes for, education and schools. And so I think that's, Mamdani is an amazing communicator. And so he can evoke very easily that image of what housing means if we're talking about housing as a community. And I know any parent here, like your outside space, outside your home is so critical, whether it's tiring your kids out, where they're going, I'm guilty, right? Or where they go as they grow older to meet their friends and form new relationships. I don't think we can ever, in a city as dense as New York, think of housing without also thinking of the connected space.
If you don't mind me putting in a plug, I just so encourage you to read our report, Creating and Capturing Real Estate Value to Generate Dedicated Revenue for Parks and Open Space. I mean, this is just from a few weeks ago, but we have some very, very specific ideas in there that I think city planning specifically could run with. One is about capturing value from the IBX corridor. The 17 new stations along the IBX route will generate thousands of units of new housing from transit-oriented development. But right now, there's no plan to also create the open space that those communities are going to need when they become denser and when they add population. But the value that will be created through the along the IBX route can be captured, at least a small portion, to be able to reinvest in creating new open space in parts of the route that desperately need it, and to invest in maintaining the parks and open space and programming the parks and open space that are already along that route. That feels like a major opportunity, but we have to seize it now. And the second one I'll just briefly mention is council members have talked to us a lot about, look, some council members have negotiated, and you mentioned the Avert project. Councilmember Krishnan in his district is doing a similar project, or relatedly, a project on Queens Boulevard that has extracted some significant concessions from the developer to create new open space there. But the way that we do this as a city is so piecemeal right now. And most council members don't know that these options are on the table. So if you know that this is something that you can advocate for and negotiate around, then potentially there's enormous opportunity for all kinds of projects, both the ones that go through ULURP and even some that are built as of right. But the way that it happens today is a handful of local elected officials are pushing for those kinds of investments, and in most cases they just don't happen. So planning could play a role, whether it's a density bonus in exchange for maintaining local parks and investing in new ones. Toronto's done that. Austin, Texas has done that. Other cities too. But also the idea of making sure that there's an obvious menu of options at the local level to understand, hey, if as a local elected official, I want to support parks and open space in my community, how can I do that through land use? And right now that is knowledge that only a few elected officials really have, but it should be something that every local official has as a playbook that they can use when those projects go through the process. So super happy to talk more. Obviously something we've written about a lot, but I really appreciate the question. Let me head to the front row, and then I see a hand up right there on the end. Yep, perfect. Thank you.
Go ahead. You're already standing. Okay. Is it on? Yes. Thanks.
Yes.
My name is Paula Ricard. I'm the president of the Battery Conservancy. I heard many great ideas, but I think a very actionable one is, Alan, when you identified, why don't we all agree on 5 to 10 barriers on the city bureaucracy that we should all agree should be worked upon, and that could be like the Dan Doctor of moment of let's make this happen.
Or the Zoran Mamdani moment,
exactly,
right?
Yes.
of what could happen, because
Yes.
it is something that I think someone like him who's thinking outside the box would be able to do.
So I was going to ask each of you if you could even identify one, or if we don't have enough time, to Center for an Urban Future to follow up even with this room on a survey that each of us send, which is the thing we think we would prioritize, and then share the results. And probably Deputy Mayor Kerson would be happy to hear that feedback. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, jump in.
Oh,
Please.
please. Yeah. Do you mind passing Deputy Mayor the microphone?
Come on up.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to make sure
She's
everybody
going
on
to stand
the
up and
live
say,
can
make
hear
it
you,
happen.
yeah.
So, no, I just want to say I don't often get to speak and then sit around and hear the conversation. So I do want to thank everyone for all of the amazing insights that you've all provided today. And I'm hearing a lot of really great through lines, and while I work to bring all of my agencies operating in the public realm together, I really do want to encourage some of what Deputy Mayor Joshi was talking about, all of these different groups that are organizing and activating inside the public space to come together too. I love the work that the City Parks Foundation is doing to bring all of the folks coming together. There are different operating models that really are at their core about these underlying protections around land use, right-of-way, and parkland and city property generally all have very different kinds of protections on them. One of the things we're really excited about in the Charter Revision Commission is hopefully trying to rationalize that, because it really does unlock different models when you treat something as just straightforward city-owned property versus right-of-way versus parkland. And so some of that drives some of these different models. And I think when all of the different people operating between the building lines, both city agencies and nonprofits, are talking to each other, we can find the best model that works for everyone. Some of this is definitely policy we have to fix. Some of this is process we have to fix. But that sort of underlying, and culture, I understand there's culture challenges, but that sort of underlying land use constraint is big, and it's sort of a through line in all of the ways that our law department looks at things, that these agencies look at things. So really encourage the YIMBY folks and the green infrastructure folks and the park folks and the street safety folks kind of all together looking at the models that work, because it's all the same agencies trying to implement these things. And if we can kind of pick the best of all of the groups, we can create something that works for everyone.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So encouraging to hear. Yeah, back to you, Grace. Thank you.
Hi, thanks everyone for your thoughts. So my name is Grace Diamond. I used to be an employee for the Central Park Conservancy, and now have just kind of like
thrown myself into understanding conservancies, private-public partnerships. And I guess something that I love hearing more from like people in the audience, there is definitely a place from like the bottom up for like these employees of these groups to kind of help with your advocacy, but just going through my personal experience, like I don't even have a great understanding of what the conservancy, like the one that I worked for, what their contract with the city is. Like I tried a few different like freedom of information requests, and maybe like I could have a sidebar conversation on like how to be successful with that. But I wasn't grounded in much context of like how my day-to-day related to like what greater work my conservancy was doing, and then like what their relationship with the city is like. So I guess my idea is that there is a lot of passion on the teams that like join these groups, and that could be a really strong place of advocacy, besides just like a citywide emergency and the people that use it. So just wanted to offer that as an idea.
Yeah, there's a microphone there, and then we'll come back to the front. Yeah, thank you.
Cool. Thank you. Hello. Hi, Katie Denny Horowitz, North Brooklyn Parks Alliance. And I don't know if I'm last in questions. I don't know how much time we have, but I don't have a new idea. I just want to echo something we've talked about before. And Eli, I'm glad you brought up your last report with earned revenue, because in sort of bookending the Q&A portion, if indemnification is paramount, I would argue so too is earned revenue opportunities. And that the challenges that we've heard from a lot of folks, whether it's fickle philanthropy or trouble getting permitting that could possibly generate $1 million, or even the cultural tension that we have at the agency, where we as public-private partners are essentially fundraisers and championing and calling out our work and trying to get credit for the work we do in parks may create tension with the agency, but it's something we have to do because we have to fundraise and prove our worth in the private sector. If we have mechanisms that are inherent, a lot of these challenges can be alleviated because we rely on sustainable mechanisms as opposed to whims and trends in the philanthropic and political communities. So Eli, just echoing your remarks, and I would love if this was taking place at the same time as the earned revenue conversation, because they're so intertwined. So thank you for bringing this forward.
And your group is doing some really interesting things along with some other people in terms of using the New York State bid authorizing legislation to have a sustainable revenue stream in a very different way for a network of parks. And I think that's something that is really worth exploring and facilitating. Again, Bryant Park was done in 1983. There's no reason it can't be done in a different way and a more equitable way in places outside of Midtown Manhattan.
Great, thank you. I'll go to Travis, then we'll go, Ernesto, thank you. And then, great, but probably time for two more.
Thank you, great panel. Thanks for organizing all this stuff. I'm Travis Terry. I'm wearing a number of hats, but I'll put on the one for the Friends of the Queensway. First, thanks to Ya-Ting and to Deputy Mayor Joshi and Deputy Mayor Kerson for allowing for the Queensway to continue forward. But I just want to make two quick points and then maybe make a suggestion. First point I just wanted to make was about politics. I think this gets lost in the shuffle a lot on public-private partnerships. People ask me all the time, why did the Queensway take so long? And the answer is Bill de Blasio. I mean, let's just be frank. Because he didn't see the value in creating a park that didn't have the necessary private funding connected to it. And in Central Queens, you can't raise that. Secondly, Central Queens didn't support him. So it wasn't of interest, that area, necessarily to invest a significant amount of attention into the park. The other point I would just make is on public-private partnerships, and I love P3s because they solve a lot of problems, is we just can't get too reliant on them, because particularly in low-income or working-class communities, the businesses are not going to contribute. The people can't afford to contribute. You just can't raise the money. Businesses, I talk to, particularly in Queens, I talk to cultural institutions and park leaders all the time, and they say they speak to business leaders, and business leaders are like, look, if you were in Manhattan, I'd give you all this money, but you're in Queens. So the Parks Department operation and maintenance budget is critical in raising that to keep an even playing field. And I mean, in Flushing Meadow Park, Andrew and I are both on the board, like it takes months to get a playground fixed, and it's crazy. So I really think that the value of P3 is really important, but doesn't always fit everywhere. The idea I had, and Alan, we should talk about this at Abney too, but the idea that I just wanted to throw out there, I am obsessed with youth sports, and I think the barriers to providing youth sports activities to the rich and the poor is gross. And so maybe there's a way to, or we have all the major sports leagues in the city of New York that are headquartered here. We have some great teams. I'm a Mets fan, so we'll push on the Yankees. Hopefully the Knicks will win. It's killing me. But maybe there's a way to organize a committee of all the sort of sports league leaders and owners to come together and build a public-private partnership with the city so that we can continue to invest in youth sports and provide opportunities in areas that people don't have. Thank you.
Can I say one thing about
Please,
the,
yeah.
the comment about not being able to raise money in Queens? I'm from Queens, so I understand. I think that's what the value of something like the Green Fund brings, because our goal is to try to bring money to communities that can't raise it on their own. And what we hear from funders is they don't know how to distribute their money in a way that gets it out to the right organizations. But because we have staff that are vetting all the proposals and are providing the information about whether or not the groups are complying with, guidelines, et cetera, we're able to get money out to communities that can't raise it on their own. And I think that if we were to do any sort of citywide campaign, we would have to focus on that, because we don't need to raise money for Midtown Manhattan. We need to raise money for Queens.
Thank you, Travis. Yes, I saw one more hand up at the back, and then, to the front. And then that's probably the last question.
Great panel, everyone. I'm Ted Enoch. I'm at a private-public partnership at City Parks Foundation side of the Partnership for Parks program. A lot of my leaders and former leaders are up on the panel right now. And I was just recently an engagement lead on the city's first urban forest plan. I've had 3 chapters of my public-private career, one in DC, one in Philadelphia, and now here in New York City. I've observed in DC and in Philadelphia at universities, the work-study departments did an incredible job of getting employees deployed at nonprofits and government opportunities where 60 to 90% of the salaries were paid by the work-study department, and they would increase the gifts, they would increase the grants so that people doing public sector work would be employed. In Philadelphia, nonprofits would typically have 30 and 40 work-study employees from colleges from across the city in their workforce. I am not seeing that. I don't have an encyclopedic observation of New York City, but it seems like that sector partnership is not quite optimized here. And there's, we know that the permit glut is happening. People can't process these permits. That's just the type of work that I was doing as an undergrad. So I feel like there's unrealized potential with the next generation of workforce and work-study opportunities to really get people involved in the public sector.
That's great. Thank you. And then one more from our audience, and then I've got one last question for our panelists.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for the discussion from Queens as well. So Queens today has been quite in the topic. Part of Paseo Park, 34th Avenue, open streets. My question come in, and I've been working in public space as a designer, as an advocate for over 15 years, and I've dealt with all of the agencies in terms of delivering public space. So public space is not always being delivered by parks, but public space is delivered by DOT, and it's delivered by many other agencies. And delivering public space as well, we need money, and we need agencies to come in, right? And without having an agency that focuses on public space, to be able to deliver cohesive public space, but as well financially cohesive public space, like how do we bring these agencies together and think about public space instead of putting it all on parks or on DOT? Yeah.
I think it goes back to what Ya-Ting, what Ya-Ting said, it has to come from the top. And when the Office of Public Realm was created, that was the message that was sent, was it doesn't matter what acronym, it could be EDC, it could be DOT, it could be parks, it doesn't really matter, because people don't know the difference between all of those agencies, and they shouldn't. They just know whether or not they have access to clean, well-maintained public space, and they need to see the capital improvements happen.
That's great. Thank you. Well, I want to just take one more moment before we close out to ask all of you for maybe a final thought. And what I'm hoping to ask you about is, we heard, first of all, you all have brought up so many great ideas today. Our audience, so many great ideas as well. Thank you all so much, not just for being here and for your advocacy, but really for your ideas, your thinking. We know this is a mayor who has said not only that he wants to be excellent, but that he wants to govern audaciously. And I keep coming back to that word when we want to say, and too many times I think we get together and we sort of talk about not just the challenges, but the feeling that things can't change. But this is a mayor who said very explicitly, he's here to make change. So I want to ask all of you for one more idea, just one, for this mayor, big or small, about leveraging or unlocking more of the potential of our public realm partners to do more good to support our city. Maybe, Tim, I'll start with you because I know you've got 5 of them, but I'd love to hear just one more idea from each of you directly to the mayor. What should he do?
I would focus on that difference between 62% fair and poor for the Bronx and 29% fair and poor parks in Manhattan. This is a mayor who is focused on equity and community. I'd say do a contest of, he's also an incredible communicator. Work with communities to have individuals tell the stories, and not just gardeners, but soccer league folks and someone who is passionate about their park to tell the story of their park in the context of a citywide campaign where the city is matching in an indexed way contributions from corporations and others and individuals that's celebrating passionate people about parks to address those inequities.
Awesome. Thank you.
I'm biased, so I'm going to say that, again, to actually move the needle in a bureaucracy, you need a team focused on this work. So whether it's an office, whether it is assigning existing people within, City Hall, when you guys collectively come together with your asks, you need to know who to go to actually make that ask. So that's got to be really clear. It's an incredible opportunity. I think that we, in fact, are on the brink of having the first real public realm mayor of the city in terms of how the mayor sees all of the sort of opportunities for public space activation with the World Cup and the Knicks viewing parties, et cetera, et cetera. So, but if there's not a sustained group that is working and grinding it out, the day in, day out, again, not sexy work, but that is the work effectively to move all of these ideas. It's really going to kind of be dispersed, and all the agencies are going to go back to just kind of dealing with their day-to-day emergencies. So we need a dedicated team focused on this at City Hall.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think we don't yet have a vision for parks in this city. There is no North Star that everybody is all driving towards. And 1% is not a North Star, and fixing bureaucracy is not a North Star. There is an opportunity to think about public space and public parks and have a real vision of what it means. And that means the 1,700 parks, recreation spaces, beaches, right? If you have somebody really ambitious, you can make Flushing Meadows Corona Park the next Central Park. You could put CUNY housing. You could put CUNY housing there. You could put senior living in there. New York City's first affordable senior community sitting inside of Flushing Meadows Corona Park and still have enough space. You need bold visions right now. And if there's one person who could do it, Zoran Mamdani has the ability to galvanize city and interest around doing it, but he has to decide he wants to do it. And in the meantime, we have to do a better job of talking about parks as a solution to affordability, right? Last night on the High Line, 350 people went to a piano bar. that was completely free with Alan Cummings, producer, and Daphne Rubin Vega, and it's happening every Monday night for free on the High Line. We did a plant sale where everything was super affordable because people can't afford to buy them in nurseries, and we propagated our own plants. We in the process made $25,000 for Friends of the High Line, went back directly to the park, and people got to take a piece of the High Line home, essentially for free. And we put $2.5 million of public art on the park every single year. And museums are wonderful, but there's still all these barriers, both real in terms of ticket prices and also invisible, that people don't want to walk in, but when they go. So that's another solution to the affordability crisis. And we have to start talking about our parks and recreation spaces and beaches and open spaces and plazas as a piece of how we solve this affordability crisis. Thanks, Alan.
I don't think I have anything that's particularly novel, but I would say the audacious part of this mayor is the place to focus. When it comes to the inner workings of the Parks Department, it's really setting the requirements and then making sure the agency meets it. And just one small snippet, but I think it's the right path forward is, what are the requirements? Some cities have said if you don't issue a permit in 90 days, it's automatically issued, right? So now there is an actual result for agencies not moving quickly, and it's very tangible. Those, to me, are very easy ways to govern and get progress, because the debate is, right, that's all out. It's just common sense. I know when I was there, the wait list for getting a street tree was 3 years. I was like, that's not a wait list. That's just forever, right? Just rip that thing up and figure out how to plant street trees. We shouldn't accept things like a wait list is 3 years, or it takes 2 years to sign with a plaza partner. Those are imaginary, useless numbers. So really setting the right requirements for the agencies that are outcome oriented and just saying you must get there, they will get there. They're the brightest minds in New York City live in these agencies. And given that challenge, they will meet it. The other thing I would say, and it harkens back to what Deputy Mayor Julia Kerson said, which is, this is all infrastructure. And so we wouldn't, we have a system of grading the cleanliness of parks, which I think is really hard to stomach for those of us that go to those parks, because it's not reflective. And so we don't have a measure of how poorly our parks, especially in the outer boroughs, are maintained, because statistically it doesn't show up. So I think this is an area where just as we have a real visceral reaction when a EMT or a fire department doesn't show up within a similar amount of time, we need that kind of a critical indicator which shows the health of our city by the maintenance level of our most neglected parks. And that whole system, the current system, is not reflective of that. It has got to be a much more realistic, grounded version.
Yeah. Thank you, Meera.
Oh, it's hard to be the last one on this. I'm torn between the sort of stuff that Ya-Ting has been talking about, because I've been spending so much of my time thinking about how to make those changes, and they're critical. But I think I'm going to go the other side and think big picture about standing next to the mayor, announcing a citywide campaign for parks and raising awareness among all New Yorkers about how parks and open spaces are funded or not, and how much is needed. Because I think that New Yorkers don't understand. They look at their park and they say, well, the city should be doing that. Why would I contribute to that? And there is no understanding that you can support your park, whether you volunteer or you write a check. And I think that we've been working against that for a long time. So that, I think, would be my hope. I mean, the other thing that I would add to that is, because we are a programming organization and everything we provide is free, but we're only in 300 parks. There are 1,700 parks. There are 1,000 open streets and plazas and gardens and everything else. And we don't have enough money to be everywhere right now, and I would love to be everywhere.
Thank you, Heather. Awesome.
All right, thank you so much to our panelists for the conversation this morning. If we can get another round of applause just to close them out. And another thank you also to Deputy Mayor Kerson for joining us this morning for her remarks and for sticking with us through the entire program.
That was amazing.
I am Stephanie. I'm CUF's Chief of Staff, and on behalf of our on behalf of our staff, thank you all so much for joining us today. For everybody in this room and also for those who tuned in online, another big thank you to the NYC Green Fund for making all of our today's event and all of our research on sustainably supporting parks possible. Center for an Urban Future does have a new report coming out very soon, specifically around public-private partnerships, so definitely be on the lookout for that release shortly, and we look forward to seeing you at the next event.
Thank you.